Deep in the forest, where the trees reached enormous heights and every step in the dark seemed far from the world, there stood an old hut. It was woven from branches, as if the forest magic itself had helped it grow from the earth. Its mistress, Lina, had lived here for many years, and it seemed that this forest had been her home since birth. Everyone knew that the forest held many secrets, but some were better left unfound. Lina was not afraid of the forest. For her, it was a place of peace and reflection, though sometimes in the evening, when the sun had already hidden behind the horizon, she felt how the darkness enveloped her and how strange sounds came from deep within the woods. She had heard these sounds since childhood, but with each passing year they grew more troubling. Distant cries, whispers, the rustling of leaves, all of these were part of her life, but no less terrifying. That evening, Lina felt that something was wrong. The air had grown dense, like a damp cloth wrapping around her, creating a sense that something was watching. She turned back toward her hut, but an unfamiliar scent in the wind made her stop. It was something strange, unlike usual. Lina knew this was no ordinary change in the wind. It was the shadow. There was a legend in the forest, passed down from generation to generation. It spoke of a creature that, according to the old stories, lived deep in the forest. It could not be seen by day, for it hid among the trees and the hissing sounds of the night. It was called the shadow, and it never appeared in the light. Those who encountered it could not remember what had happened afterward, but they became different people. Those who dared venture into the depths of the forest in search of the shadow rarely returned, and if they did, it was only to speak of an inexplicable feeling that overwhelmed them after seeing the gaze from the darkness. Lina didn't believe in legends. She had lived here her entire life, and in her eyes, the forest was simply part of her everyday life. But that evening, something was unusual, and the further she walked, the more she felt the tension around her building. She had always trusted her intuition, but tonight, something made her doubt. Her steps became heavy, and an inexplicable fear began to rise in her heart. From time to time, she heard quiet rustling behind her, growing closer and closer. But when she turned around, she could see no one. The feeling that someone was watching her, slowly, silently closing in, never left her. Every movement became more cautious, but it didn't help. The forest seemed alive, as though every stone and every tree had its own heart and was watching her. She managed to take a few more steps, and suddenly, a figure appeared before her. Its contours were blurry, like mist. Lina froze. Was it a person or something else? She tried to gather all her strength to move forward, but something invisible held her still. She felt as though an unseen hand was pulling her, not letting her move. With each passing moment, the shadow became more real, and just when Lina was finally able to lift her foot and take a step, she saw something she shouldn't have seen. A large, black shadow slowly coiled around her legs, like an evil snake, stopping her movement. All surrounding sounds fell silent. The forest no longer watched her. It had become what she feared. The shadow was here, and it was not benevolent. In Lina's heart, there was no room for doubt. She knew that now, she would have to face what she had feared. Part 2. Lina's breath caught in her throat as the shadow began to tighten around her, colder than anything she had ever felt. Her body froze in place, but her mind raced. She had heard of the shadow, of course, but she had never believed it was real. It was just a story. a legend passed down by the old people to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. Now, it was no longer a story. It was here, with her, in the flesh. Her heart pounded in her chest, and a sharp pang of fear shot through her. The air around her seemed to grow thicker, heavier. The wind stopped, and the leaves fell into eerie silence. The forest no longer whispered. It seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. The shadow continued to coil around her, its presence suffocating. Lina struggled, trying to free herself, but the more she fought, the tighter the grip became. She could feel it wrapping around her legs, then her waist, and finally, creeping toward her chest. It was as though the very darkness itself had come alive to consume her. "Let me go," Lina cried out, her voice trembling. But the shadow didn't respond. It didn't even move. Instead, a low, distorted voice echoed from within the darkness. It was deep and guttural, like the sound of an animal growling, and it sent chills down her spine. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered. "You belong to the forest now." Lina's thoughts raced. She knew the stories. The shadow took those who strayed too far into the woods, those who sought to challenge it or uncover its secrets. But she had always thought those stories were meant to scare people, not real warnings. And yet, here she was, trapped in its grasp. Suddenly, the shadow shifted, releasing its hold on her for a moment. Lina gasped for air, her limbs aching, and she stumbled backward. Her heart raced as she turned to face the dark figure before her. The shadow seemed to grow larger, taller, its form shifting and swirling like smoke. It was no longer just a dark shape. It was something more, something ancient, something far older than the forest itself. "You cannot run from me," the voice repeated, this time closer, as though it was right next to her ear. "I am the darkness, the fear, the ancient curse that has lived within these woods for centuries." Lina stumbled backward again, her legs shaking beneath her. She wanted to scream, but no sound came from her mouth. The shadow reached out, its tendrils of darkness closing in once more. Then, without warning, Lina's mind was filled with an overwhelming sensation. A vision of the forest, the trees, the darkness, all swirling together into one vast, infinite void. She felt as if she was falling into an abyss where time and space no longer existed. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't think. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vision vanished. Lina found herself back in the forest, standing alone in the clearing. The shadow was gone. The forest was silent once more. But Lina knew she was not alone. The forest had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others before her. The shadow had not finished with her. It had only just begun. Part 3. Lina stood motionless, feeling the coldness of the night seep deeper into her bones. The shadow was gone, but she knew that it hadn't left her. She could feel its presence lurking in the corners of her mind, a constant reminder that the forest had taken her. No matter how hard she tried to shake the feeling, it stayed with her. The forest seemed normal again, at least at first glance. The trees stood tall, their branches swaying lightly in the wind, and the moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting a pale glow on the ground. But Lina knew better. The forest was never truly calm. The shadow was always watching. Her heart thudded in her chest as she slowly began to walk back toward the hut, each step feeling heavier than the last. She couldn't explain what had just happened, but she felt a deep, gnawing fear in her stomach. What was the shadow? Why had it come to her? And why had it let her go? As she walked, the air grew colder again. The forest seemed to close in around her, its dark silhouette pressing down on her with each passing moment. She quickened her pace, hoping to make it back to the safety of her hut before something else happened. But it was already too late. The shadows around her began to shift again, and she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps following her. They were soft at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, but soon they grew louder, closer, until they were right behind her. Lina spun around, but there was nothing there, just the thick, impenetrable darkness of the forest. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She had to get away, but her legs felt like lead, her body unwilling to move. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was the same shadowy form she had seen before, its shape indistinct and ever-changing, its eyes glowing faintly in the night. Lina froze, her heart pounding in her chest as it slowly advanced toward her. "You cannot escape," the shadow whispered again, its voice low and haunting. "You belong to me now." Lina stumbled backward, but her feet refused to move. She was trapped in the forest, with nowhere to run. The shadow was closing in on her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Part 4. Lina's mind raced, trying desperately to find a way out. But the shadow's presence seemed to swallow her thoughts, leaving her with nothing but fear. She could hear the faint whispers in the air, the sound of movement just beyond her sight. She was no longer sure what was real and what was just a figment of her imagination. With every passing moment, the shadow grew stronger, its tendrils stretching toward her, its cold presence suffocating her. Lina felt as if the very essence of her being was being drained away. It was as if the forest itself was feeding on her, using her fear to grow more powerful. The figure before her reached out, its form stretching like dark smoke. Lina could see its eyes more clearly now, pale and empty, filled with a deep void. It felt like they were staring into her soul, pulling her deeper into the darkness. She wanted to scream, to run, but the words caught in her throat. The shadow's grip on her mind was too strong. She couldn't fight it. She couldn't even think straight. All she could feel was its cold touch, creeping up her spine, freezing her in place. "Why are you doing this?" Lina finally managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. She didn't expect an answer, but the shadow responded nonetheless. "Because you are mine," it said simply, its voice now a low hum that vibrated through her bones. "You will never leave this forest. You will never escape me." The shadow's form expanded, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket, and Lina could feel her body growing weaker. It was as if her very life force was being drained by its touch, and she could do nothing to stop it. Then, in the distance, she heard a faint sound, footsteps. At first they were soft, like the rustling of leaves, but they quickly grew louder, closer. Lina's heart skipped a beat. Could it be someone coming to help her? Or was it another trick of the forest? Before she could answer that question, the figure that had been chasing her suddenly froze, its form becoming still. For a brief moment, Lina thought she was saved, but then the shadow let out a low growl, and it turned toward the new sound. A dark figure stepped out from the shadows, its outline difficult to make out in the dim light. Lina felt a strange sense of recognition, as if she knew this person from somewhere. But before she could figure it out, The new figure spoke. "Leave her alone." The shadow recoiled at the voice, its form shrinking back into the darkness. Lina could feel the tension in the air, as if a battle of wills was taking place. The figure advanced, stepping closer to Lina. "Who are you?" Lina asked, her voice shaking. The figure didn't answer right away, but when it finally did, the voice was calm and reassuring. "I am here to take you out of this forest. It's not too late." Lina didn't know whether to trust this person, but she had no choice. The shadow was still lurking nearby, waiting for any opportunity to strike. She took a hesitant step toward the figure, and as if sensing her decision, it reached out a hand. "Come with me," it urged. Lina didn't need to be told twice. She took the figure's hand, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt the cold grip of the shadow loosen its hold on her. The forest no longer seemed as oppressive, and the air seemed to clear just a little. But as they turned to leave, Lina heard the voice of the shadow one last time, its words echoing through the trees. "This is not over," it hissed. "You cannot escape what you are." Lina didn't look back. She didn't want to know what it meant. She just wanted to escape the forest and the darkness that had nearly consumed her.